Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are back. Today we're going to be doing the Gospel of Luke. Once again, I'm joined by Ijaz Trini. And this is, you're going to surprise me with stuff in this one that I haven't heard of. Isn't that right,
Mhm.
Ijaz?
Yes. Yes. I
Uh,
think most people, the information we're going to give, they haven't heard it before.
Looking forward to it. These are like durus, man. I'm really enjoying the stuff. I'm learning a lot of stuff every single day, and it's really enjoyable to get into a new field. Even though I'm just scratching the surface, I wouldn't even consider myself a beginner in this, but it's just really really interesting, and I'm really appreciating you being there and holding my hand on this path.
Well, I appreciate that you're holding my hand because you have the warmest hands I've ever held.
Thank you, Ijaz. Carrying on, um, I want to share a thought about the sources that I about the sources that I go through. I'm mainly using Arabic sources, and it's really strange because they only use Arabic sources more or less. They don't really seem to be focusing on Western sources. So it seems like the information that I have is slightly outdated. While at
Mhm.
the same time, it seems like much of what I have is sufficient to respond to the points that Colin brings up, which is quite interesting. And now you're bringing this stuff, which is quite eye-opening as well, and is just surprising to me. I'm really enjoying this. Again, I'm really enjoying this.
Likewise.
Whenever you want, let's just go for it. Let's start.
All
I
right,
have no
Bismillah.
limit today, by the way. I switched it out with water today. So,
Alhamdulillah. I'm doing water as well. In fact, my new coffee cup got lost by Amazon. So
oh
they,
man,
they're really doing me a tough one these days. Right, Bismillah, let's go.
Bismillah.
The series on the authorship and dating of the Gospels. Let's get right to it with the Gospel according to Luke. If you'll remember from the introduction, we started off by talking a lot about what Martin Hingel has to say. It must be asserted that in the present state of our knowledge, the titles of the Gospels are by no means late products from the 2nd century, but must be very old. With a considerable degree of probability, they can be traced back to the time of the origin of the 4 Gospels between 69 and 100, and are connected with their circulation in the communities. Now, Martin Debellius agrees with this and turns our attention specifically to Luke and Acts. Both writings, Gospel and Acts, were offered to the literary reading public from the very beginning under the name of Luke as author. He also explains that since Luke's Gospel as well as Acts both have the name of the addressee in their introduction, that the name of the author would have been known as well, and it would have been indicated on a tag attached to the scroll. Carson and Moo echo numerous other scholars when they say, it is hard to understand why Luke's name would have been attached to the gospel if it had not been there from the beginning. The manifest tendency in the early church was to associate apostles with the books of the New Testament. The universal identification of a non-apostle as the author of almost 1/4 of the New Testament speaks strongly for the authenticity of the tradition. And
So I think we've deconstructed that claim multiple times. There's no need to refute it again. But I just find it curious that if you read what he's quoted on the screen, these are mostly assumptions and presumptions, which is what the Quran accuses the Christians and Jews of doing when it comes to the crucifixion and generally the life of Jesus. They have nothing but assumption. So I just find that curious. Let's continue.
Just a quick point. Just a quick point. So if you wouldn't mind, for those who I don't know because I don't know if we're gonna stick this into one video or not.
Mhm.
Very briefly, in under a minute, if you can, summarize what's wrong with these assumptions.
So the basic premise seems to be no one would attribute this name or this title to someone who is a non-apostle, someone who's not a disciple. And so that does not strike me as a strong claim. It is very clear that the early church understood that perhaps it is the name Luke was circulated at some point, but as we indicated in the previous streams or videos, we pointed out that At least from our perspective and the scholarly consensus, the Gospels are primarily anonymous, but then they write in the name of other people. This is called homonymous authorship. And at the time in which these works were written, it was normal to write in the name of another person, ipsa summa vox, that is, to write in the voice of a person. So the distinction has to be then asked to Colin, how do you distinguish between writing in the voice of a person and that person actually writing themselves? And so this curious case, well, it has, if it's a non-apostle, why would the church choose someone who's not an apostle to write or to attribute an identity to this gospel? The simple fact of the matter is, it possibly likely is that because it's so much later in the tradition, it did not need an apostle's name to be attached to it. And secondly, it would not attract as much criticism because it's not somebody as important, but it's still a notable individual within the Christian collective memory. So yeah, I think
Right.
that summarizes it pretty well, I hope. Let's continue. Bismillah.
Church history is unanimous. Marshall notes, there is never any suggestion of a rival candidate for the honor of writing the gospel.
I want to point out here that Papias does not mention Luke in his surviving sources, in his surviving writings, actually. So
Really?
the first person I think that actually mentions Luke as being the author of this gospel is Irenaeus in the year 185.
So Papias mentions the other three, but not this one?
He mentions Matthew and Mark. I'm not sure if he mentions
Oh.
John specifically, at least in the way that we know John. But the very first person is Irenaeus. And strikingly enough, the quote on the screen that we're about to see next, every one of these individuals, as on the screen now, are around the year 180 onwards.
Okay.
So it's almost a century later that the first attributions to Luke come up in the traditions regarding this particular gospel. A century.
Right. These people pass away a century later, or they're writing their works a century
Writing a century later.
Okay.
And it's curious because we should expect that earlier authors would know that Luke wrote this gospel. And because we don't see it earlier and we only see it later, the question must be asked, why does that occur? And you will notice that Colin does not address this question. So let's continue.
Leon Morris notes, tradition unanimously affirms this author to be Luke. This is attested by the early heretic Marcion, the Muratorian fragment, the anti-Marcionite prologue to Luke, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, and others. And from Tertullian, the same authority of the apostolic churches will afford evidence to the other gospels also, which we possess equally through their means and according to their usage. I mean the gospels of John and Matthew, whilst that which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was. For even Luke's form of the gospel men usually ascribe to Paul. From Irenaeus, Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Clement of Alexandria also refers to the gospel written by Luke. For external evidence, we can look at P75, which is dated between 175 and 225 and ascribes the book to Luke.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. So,
Go back to that slide, please go back to that slide.
Okay. There we go.
Yeah.
So when I first saw this, I think I spit my coffee out the first time I saw this video, because when Colin recorded this was in 2019, right? And the research that had already existed before this within the last 5 years previous to that, so between 2014 onwards, they point out that the dating for P75 has actually moved a bit later. So there is a wonderful scholar called Dr. Brent Nongbury, and he wrote an entire, I think, a journal article, peer-reviewed, of course, on this manuscript, P75 for Luke. Now, traditionally, it had been dated to the late second and third century. If you go to the INTF website, so most New Testament translations in English today come from a Greek text. This is actually the Greek text here. The Nestle Allen text. It's published by the INTF at the University of Munster, and they firmly put this in the 3rd century. So you will notice that he acts as if it's within the late second century, but the dating extends from the late second to the early fourth century, with a strong possibility for the third century. So somewhere along the third century, this exists. But what has the paleographic evidence shown? So the way that we date gospels in the manuscript tradition, that's handwritten documents, you date them based on the writing style. So the way that letters are written change over time, right? They evolve essentially. And so what Dr. Brent Nongby pointed out in his paper is that the writing style found in P75 is closest to a codex called Codex Vaticanus. And that is dated to the early 4th century. So its
Okay.
closest companion, 4th century.
Okay.
So I understand why he's using outdated references. I understand why he's appealing to them. But I want to point out that Dr. Larry Hurtado, who died not too long ago, on his blog in 2016, did not refute nor reject the redating of this manuscript. And he was a conservative evangelical scholar. And secular scholars like Clarissa and Orsini put it in the third century with a possibility for the fourth as well. So as you can see, the consensus is slowly shifting to a later dating rather than early. And this is perhaps, I think, the only manuscript evidence that Colin appeals to.
Mm,
Everything else is an exercise in thought, in which case you have presumptions, assumptions, and theories. So
okay.
that's peculiar. I
Okay.
hope that makes sense for anyone
It
who
does. Yeah,
watches.
yeah. It's alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. I'm following. I'm following well today. Let's
Alhamdulillah.
carry on.
Let's continue.
The book to Luke. By now, you should be getting used to the fact that history affirms the unanimous tradition of the authorship of the Gospels. Internal and external evidence combine to point strongly to Luke, the doctor, Paul's dear friend, as the author. Now let's look at some internal evidence in the Gospel to figure out some characteristics that the writer of the Gospel may have had. Plausibly a Gentile, was obviously educated, proficient in Greek, and a versatile and competent writer. We can't go too much further in looking at the internal evidence without considering the connection between Luke and Acts. Ever since Henry Cadbury's work back in the 1920s, scholars have been much more aware of the implications of this connection. Both books written by the same author and probably separated due to logistical issues. The books are much larger back then, and so it makes sense to separate them out for convenience. Leon Morris gives us a helpful analysis. In Acts, there are 4 passages in which the writer uses the pronoun we, and then he lists them. These appear to have been taken from the diary of one of Paul's companions. One of the we sections yields the information that the writer stayed for some time in Caesarea with Philip, the evangelist, and his 4 daughters. It was not until more than 2 years later that he and Paul sailed for Rome. This period spent with such companions must have given opportunity for discovering much about Jesus and the early church. Now he continues.
So let's pause here. You will notice that he basically makes the argument whoever wrote Acts of the Apostles. So
Please go back
uh,
to the slide, akhi.
no problem. Sorry,
Okay.
I just remember the information sometimes. So here you will see that he starts off with Acts chapter 16 in a line, in the second line. What is the problem here? He is appealing to the we verses, the we statements in Acts. So the person is clearly, whoever authored it, indicating that they were along while this was happening. They
Yeah.
were a companion to these events.
Yeah.
Small problem. We know that at least one or a couple of the we statements are later additions to the text, beginning with Acts 11:28 with Codex Bezae. So if it is that at least one we statement could be interpolated, what about the others? And it's interesting because Acts chapter 16, verse 10 specifically uses we, and it references Macedonia. So the idea is the scholars have deduced from this that whoever wrote the gospel according attributed to Luke, that this person was either from Macedonia, which again was part of Greece, or from Rome. So the person is clearly from a Gentile background. But the point here is he's trying to use the we passages as a claim to say this guy was along for the entire ride. As you will come to see shortly later on, that is not the case. But the primary argument here is just because he uses we, a person who is writing in a person's name can equally use the word we. A person who also interpolates we in a one passage, Acts 11:28, is also likely to interpolate it everywhere else throughout the Acts of the Apostles, wherever they want to. So if one of those we passages we know at a very basic level was added, then it puts into doubt the others, at least on some conceivable level. So it's up to Colin really to demonstrate why these are not later additions, or why it's not possible that they are writing in someone's name and therefore able to speak from the first person. I do need to point out as well that Luke uses I and we quite often, as in contrast to Mark and Matthew, which I
Yeah.
think you pointed out on the Matthew video and the Mark video. So that at least tells us there's a curious issue here. The guy who comes later uses the personal pronouns of I and we, but the guys who were earlier allegedly don't use those same words. Why is that the case? You will realize that Colin never addresses that point. Let's continue.
Discovering much about Jesus and the early church. Now, he continues in talking about this connection between Paul and Luke. Paul speaks of Luke as the beloved physician, referring to Colossians 4:14. Now, with respect to Luke being a physician, there is a rather humorous bit of data that Leon Morris brings to our attention. It is a very human touch that he omits the statement that the woman with the hemorrhage had spent all her money on doctors. Now, Luke, as a physician, may have been somewhat offended by that statement. We also find mention of Luke in Philemon as well. He's referred to as one of Paul's fellow workers. Now, Leon Morris once again gives us a helpful summary. Acts ends with Paul in Rome, and the author is perhaps to be looked for among those named in the captivity epistles or 2 Timothy as being with him, but not mentioned in Luke Acts. This leaves us with a small group. There seems to be no reason for thinking of any of these apart from Luke as being our author. Now, before we talk about the dating of Luke's gospel, let's talk briefly about the role of eyewitnesses in it. Richard Bauckham is talking about his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, when he says, I argue in the book that in the early church there was a principle of eyewitness testimony from the beginning, stated in Luke, Acts, and John, that the most important testimony was that of disciples who had been with Jesus from the earliest days of his ministry and could testify to the whole course of events up to and including the resurrection appearances. Now, if you'll remember from the video on the Gospel of Mark, he uses Peter kind of like
I paused it, but it didn't stop.
Say again?
I paused it, but it didn't stop. I'm not sure why it didn't stop on your end until a few seconds later. So,
Yeah, same kind of like it. Can you go back to the slide, please?
it's paused on the slide for me. Let me see if it pauses. There.
Good, good. Okay.
Right.
Is this Luke? Is Luke saying this or this quote?
Yeah. So this is primarily taken from Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. But
Yeah.
there are issues here. So this
Yeah.
is where some of the information that most Muslims and almost most Christians would not be familiar with. So there is a person called Dioscorides, and he himself was a historian and a physician who was a Gentile writing a history about medicine in the world of antiquity. Now, the format that the author of the gospel attributed to Luke uses is the exact same format that Dioscorides uses. Interestingly, the very first verses for the gospel attributed to Luke follows exactly the same, almost word for word format that Dioscorides uses. Now, why is that peculiar? So, in the same sense as the author for Luke in the first 4 verses attempts to say he wants to account everything from the very beginning, and that he's writing into a friend called Theophilus, he's also correcting the previous written traditions, because he goes on to use the word, if I'm not mistaken, it is what's the word? Akribos, which means careful. So his composition is careful compared to the others, which he uses as a source.
Right.
Now, here is the thing. Dioscorides, when he wrote his work on medicine, he actually, in the end of his introduction, which will mirror the same 4 verses that begin the gospel attributed to Luke, he says that he's writing his work, that's Dioscorides, to correct hearsay that other people had used. So it's interesting that the author who wrote the gospel attributed to Luke mirrors the exact same language, but as opposed to using the word hearsay, he instead says that he's writing a complete account, which is from the very beginning, which is also careful. He also accuses the previous people, that is the author that allegedly wrote the gospel attributed to Luke. He also accuses the other people of having attempted to write an account. Now, here is the thing: this all seems like a criticism of the previous accounts, and we know that he uses the Gospel of Mark in Luke. It's one of his primary sources. He
Right.
also uses the Q sayings as well. So now, if he's being careful and he's putting them in the right order, and he is essentially correcting them, what does that tell us about the gospel attributed to Mark? That it
So
is
I'm
not
inspired.
careful. Exactly.
Right. Right.
Right. So now that throws into doubt the gospel of Mark. But then here comes the author who writes the gospel attributed to Luke, and the way he changes some of the phrases used in Mark. So here's what happens. One of the earlier points that Colin pointed out for the Gospels of Mark and Matthew was that these have to have been written by eyewitnesses to some extent, or people who knew the eyewitnesses, because they refer to the Sea of Galilee, which is a lake, as a sea, and only a people who live near this lake would refer to it as a sea. Now, the author who writes the gospel attributed to Luke corrects this. He never refers to it as a sea. Rather, he goes for the tech. He wants it to get exactly right. This is a lake. This is not a sea. So why is he being so pedantic about these things if he understood it was written in a Semitic local context? It then tells us that he is apart from the eyewitnesses. He does not actually have a physical involvement with them or anyone who knows them. Otherwise, these minute details, which later help us understand who the author was, would not be changed in the first place. But to continue this, let's think about this a bit more.
I'd
So,
like to see the statement itself.
yes, can we bring it up on the screen? Is
Yeah,
that possible?
let me dig it up. Is there a
Can you go
specific
to
website?
BibleGateway.com?
Okay.
Yeah. So you go to BibleGateway.com. I'm making you do Bible work now.
Bible
Probably cursing with
Gateway.
every keystroke. And you're gonna type in Luke 1 semicolon. You can just copy paste it from here actually.
That's all good. It's all good. I got it. I got it.
And you wanna bring up the Lexham English Bible.
The Lexham English.
LEB. Because it's more literal and it does not allow for like interpretative translations of the text.
Right, right.
Because we want to see what the author wrote for himself, not what was interpreted on his behalf.
Okay. Let's see.
So do you want me to start over and just explain that when you bring it up?
I got it. I got it. I'm just trying to figure out how to switch the
Window?
switch the window.
Hmm.
Okay.
Does that information surprise you, what I just said to you?
It does. So can we say that the author of Luke may have been inspired more by Dioscorides more than the
Yes.
Holy Ghost?
Yes, and I'll tell you why as well. So in Mark, we're in Luke. In Luke chapter 3 to verse 1, all the way to Luke chapter 4, verse 30, the author of that gospel attributed to Luke uses the Q sayings. Remember, it's just a bunch of sayings without a narrative. Then from Luke chapter 4, verse 31 to Luke chapter 6, verse, I think it's 28, he switches to the Gospel of Mark. And then from Luke chapter 6, verse 20 to Luke chapter 7, verse 50, he switches back to Q. So you can see that he's mixing and matching sources as he goes along, and he tries to form a better narrative than what the previous authors would have used.
Now, for those who aren't aware, what are the Q sayings?
So Q sayings are an early tradition within the early church, which scholars believe existed, that are just sayings from Jesus. So they don't, it's not like as if they say they went to this hill and then they spoke on it. It just tells you what the saying that Jesus said was.
Okay.
Yeah, and the
And
Gospel of Mark is the Gospel of Mark.
and how do we, since this book doesn't, or since the Q sayings no longer exist, or it's not extant, how do we know that he's quoting the Q sayings?
Because the phraseology used is different from what the author's style is. So we can sense that the Gospel of Mark, whoever wrote that Gospel, used the sayings, and then Luke also uses those same sayings, but he edits them. So the way that someone uses a pre-existent source is distinguished by their writing style and the way that they rephrase and contextualize those compositions themselves.
Is this something? I mean, is there a consensus in regards to
Yeah,
the Q
this
sayings
is a
being
literal consensus, yes.
okay? Even with like
Evangelical
right?
scholars, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yes. So
Right.
this is not something like liberal scholars invented.
Okay.
A lot of Christians themselves, even Colin, appealed to a pre-existing oral tradition about Jesus. So if
Right.
you switch out oral tradition with the Q sayings, it's almost a one-to-one equivalence.
Okay.
Okay.
Here's the screenshot that of Luke 1.
Mhm.
Since many have attempted to compile an account concerning the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word from the beginning passed on to us, it seemed best to me also, because
Yes,
I
I.
have allowed all things carefully. Uh-huh. I have followed all things carefully from the beginning to write them down in orderly sequence for you, most excellent. You got to help me out with this one.
Theophilus.
Theophilus,
Yep.
so that you may know the certainty concerning the things about which you were taught.
So let's pause here. So at the very first verse, so verse 1, he points out that many people in the past attempted, that's the key word here, to give a narrative about Jesus's life and mission.
Right.
Now, they attempted, which would imply what? That they were not
Past tense.
necessarily successful in what they
Okay.
attempted. And so
Okay.
now he is now attempting to do what they attempted to do, but he does it better,
Right.
right? And he continues now, just as those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word from the beginning passed on to us. So here he is indicating that the information he has is what has been passed down, not necessarily that he interviewed people and got the information from them. This
Okay.
indicates to us that he's using pre-existing sources. And then it
Oh, couldn't it be both?
no,
Could
it can't be both because that comes up in verse 3. So,
okay.
verse 3 it says, it seemed best to me also because I have followed all things carefully from the beginning. Now, the word used here, I believe, in Greek is parakolotheo, which means follow in thought. So, he's following the narrative based on the pre existing sources that he used. If it was that it was actionable and he interviewed people, then that would not be the term that he would use.
Okay.
So the very meaning of the Greek word indicates that he is looking at the previous sources, sorted them out in his mind, and then created a narrative using these interspersed sources. And then he continues to write them, have followed all things carefully. So first he says he follows it in thought fully, and then he qualifies how he followed it in thought. He followed it carefully, akribos. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the people who attempted to write a narrative in the past were not careful in what they wrote. Does that stand
Right.
out to you? Does it make sense?
That makes perfect sense. But what if someone says he's
One
referring
second.
to he's
Let me,
referring to say what?
yeah, so I just want to pause just quickly, just to
Yeah.
put one more point here. Remember, he's modeling his opening verses on what Dioscorides wrote.
Right.
So when he says he, Luke, followed all things carefully, he's contrasting this with the statement that Dioscorides wrote, in which
Yes.
he said everything that other people had written, well, most things were based on hearsay. And
Right.
so rather than using the forceful word hearsay to attack people, he says he, Luke, is careful in his attempt as opposed to the other people's attempt.
Understood. Can we say that he's referring to all other texts except for Mark, for example?
No, because he never seems to indicate, he never actually writes down what his sources are.
Right.
What he does is he uses them in his work, and that's how we're able to understand where he derived his sources from. I
Okay.
think possibly the author here does not want to cause conflict, but just wants to give an easier narrative that is more accurate according to
Right.
his own understanding without really diminishing the words of other people in the past, I think.
Right. And to give his work some more legitimacy, I'm guessing.
Credibility. Because if you attack, then it means people must make a choice. But if you,
Right.
but on the surface, if you just say that you're being more careful, then you can put the two books next to each other and it's fine,
Right.
right?
Let's carry on.
All right, Bismillah.
Barakallah fiqh, bro.
Yep. I want to point out as well how the author of Luke mentions he's writing to a friend, right?
Oh, okay. I
The
go back
same
to
thing.
the. Should I
Yeah.
go back to the
Yep.
image?
Just quickly. Yep. Sorry.
No.
So
So
many things in my head. It's
I'll
difficult to
give
sort
the.
out.
Okay.
But I
Yeah.
think you thrive on the chaotic narrative here. So.
Oh, you know I do, bro. Let's carry on.
So, in the very third verse, can you just highlight the name Theophilus? Third verse.
Let's see if I can. Is this working for you? Can you see this?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
Yeah, salam. Ya akhi, this is technology. Check it out, man.
Oh, no, you gotta sign up to highlight things. Come on now, right? So, in the same way that the author who wrote this 4 verses, he copies from Dioscorides's format. I want to point out that Dioscorides actually points out he too is writing to a friend called Arios. So down to writing it to a friend and
If it
companion.
was the same name, akhi, if it was the same name, I would have. I just like end the stream. That's it, man. That's it. It's Dioscorides who wrote this. That's it.
But now you get the point. The exact format down to writing it to a friend to clarify things for them just
Right.
stands out. And I will tell you that the reason that Colin does not point these things out is because
Does
it
he know?
undermines the position that whoever wrote this at least was inspired, or that the person who wrote this was not attacking the other existing gospels.
Do you think he knows? Do you think he knows this stuff?
If I'm being honest, I do not think he knows it, and I'll tell you why. Because in the Gospel of Matthew video, he was willing to give people options,
Yeah.
and in this case, I've realized for the Gospel of Mark and for this Gospel as well, he does not seem to want to give people options. So either it is he knows the options undermine his core arguments, or he knows by introducing the options, it detracts from the credibility of the Gospels of Mark and Matthew.
Right. Okay.
But I will send you an invoice for everything I just said. Let's continue.
Okay, so we go back to.
Remember from the video.
Well, one sec. Need to
Pull it up again.
figure it out. Yeah.
Pretty sure your Arabic sources don't say that.
Say again?
I'm pretty sure your Arabic sources
Oh,
don't
no
go into
way,
that.
man. No way. Nothing anywhere close to that.
All right, we got like 4 minutes left.
Right? Let's go.
The video on the Gospel of Mark, he uses Peter kind of like an inclusio, like bookends. Peter is the first disciple that Mark mentions, and he's also the last. So keep that in mind as we hear from Balcom again. My identification of the inclusio of eyewitness testimony as a recognizable device in Mark is confirmed by the fact that Luke takes the trouble to produce an equivalent of it, acknowledging his debt to Peter's testimony as he had it in Mark's Gospel. The key point here is that the references to Peter as the first disciple to be named in Luke and the last to be named are not the same as Mark's. And so it is not as though the pattern in Mark has reappeared in Luke simply because of Luke's incorporation of Mark's material.
Let's just pause here quickly. If you look at this statement, you will notice that Borkham specifically says Luke takes the trouble to produce an equivalent of it. Simple. So he's looking at something that Mark did and just mimics it in different places. That does not mean anything in terms of credibility or in terms of having eyewitness testimony. It just means he used an existing template and applied it in a different place. Simple, straight to the point. So I don't understand Colin's appeal as if this is evidence that Peter was definitely, handy as an eyewitness at this point. Let's continue.
And one more from Balcom. Luke is the only synoptic evangelist who actually writes about his sources in the preface to his gospel. There he claims that his traditions come from those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. If a reader were then to read the gospel, keeping an eye out for who these eyewitnesses might be, the first point at which he or she would find a character who continues to appear through the narrative would be Luke's first reference to Peter. The eyewitnesses of Luke's preface must include Peter as at least prominent among them.
Again, this is not a good argument. Why? He mentions that it's possible that he got these traditions from people who were eyewitnesses from the beginning, but then he waits for 4 chapters to raise an eyewitness. Does that make sense to you, Brother Farid? If he could have included in that first 4 verses, Peter's tradition has been verified by me, or Peter's tradition is where I got some of my information from. He never says that. So this is an
Yeah,
implied
yeah.
evidence as opposed to an explicit one. Again, Colin is appealing to thought exercises as evidence as opposed to existing evidence as an evidence itself.
Yes. I would like to point out that in ilm al-hadith, this don't fly. You can't say, hey, I'm quoting some people who were there, therefore you got to accept whatever I say. That doesn't fly in ilm al-hadith, bro.
Oh,
Akhi, I'll tell you something, man. I'll tell you something. When a Shafi'i says, a trustworthy person said to me, this is what the scholars of hadith do. That's it, man. Like everyone starts rolling their eyes, ya akhi. No, that doesn't fly. That doesn't fly. Subhanallah. It's just really interesting, and that this is used as evidence. This
yeah.
would be used. This would be used like in ilm al hadith. They would use this against you. Like this would be used to yeah. Wallah, bro. Wallah. If your evidence is so reliable, if your source is so reliable, you got to mention it.
Yeah, you have to. I do want to point out here if one of the theories is right, and what's his name, Luke spent time in Rome, then he would have spent time with Peter, and so we would have expected Luke to spend time with Peter in some way. But
Right.
as Colin mentions in one of his earlier quotes, Luke is more attributed to Paul as a source, who himself was not an eyewitness to any of these things.
Right, right. Does Luke ever quote Paul or Peter
He quotes both Paul and Peter if we assume he wrote the Acts of the Apostles.
directly? Excuse me,
Yes,
in Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, does he quote either of them? Does he
but
ever say Peter said to me or
no, he
Paul?
doesn't. He does not phrase it in that way. He just lifts
Okay.
the word in almost exactly from Mark's Gospel.
Yeah, that doesn't fly in Ilm al-Hadith, bro. In Ilm al-Hadith, it just doesn't fly.
Now, I do imagine that one of Colin's responses is, well, Peter died fairly early. Well, and then and then Paul
Fine.
came. You know,
It's fine. It's
he's
fine if he died early. It's fine. It's fine if you heard him say something 50 years earlier. You can still say Peter said to me. You don't even have to mention when he said it to you. You just say Peter mentioned to me. That's all you need to do. To
And
say
the interesting thing is that if Luke accompanied Paul to the council, because there were 2 councils in Acts, if he did accompany Paul for at least one of them, then he would have spoken and interacted with Peter directly. And in the same way he uses the words I and we, why could he not say, and I spoke to Peter at some point? Because he clearly has the ability to do so from the first 4 verses of chapter 1.
right,
The
right.
fact that he never does so in reference to Peter is not just problematic. And so he's never in conversation with the eyewitnesses himself, which
Right.
tells you that he could not have accompanied Paul to meet any of the eyewitnesses in the first place. Yeah, I know it's like layered logic, but it gets to the heart of the matter. But let's continue.
Luke-Acts connection also becomes important when we look at dating the Gospel of Luke. There are 2 serious possibilities, a date in the early 60s or a date in the later decades of the 1st century. The latter is the view most commonly held, with AD being suggested as a round figure. On the other hand, the complete lack of interest in the fall of Jerusalem in Acts and the way in which the book ends its story before the death of Paul are strong indications of a date before AD 70. On the whole, a date not far off, AD 70, appears to satisfy all requirements.
I'm wondering why he doesn't quote Hengel, which is one of his major sources, why he doesn't quote Mu as one of his major sources in all the videos to get this point, because I don't believe they make this point. So he has
Okay.
to go to someone who is writing almost a decade earlier than his sources. This is the 1970s to get his
Right.
point. I mean,
Right.
we've discovered so many papyri since that point in time, manuscripts.
So why not Mu and Hengel or whomever?
Well, I guess because they don't say this point, therefore he can't push the date back at this
Okay.
point. So he
Okay.
has to use a different author altogether to make his
Okay.
claim. Colin, man, you got to look to diversify your sources and your method. If it seems as if he's cherry picking to come to illustrate the conclusions he already holds, as opposed to letting the scholars lead him to those conclusions in the first place.
Now, did you look up what Carson said and Hengel and those guys?
Not
Or are you just,
necessarily, but I'm just
okay,
pointing out that the fact that he doesn't quote them, but yet he quotes them for every other thing except this
okay,
one point stands out to
right.
you.
Well, let's hope. Let's hope there's no refutation video with him saying, "Hey, here you go." Let's just hope that's what happens. I'm
But
leaving this clip there. I'm leaving this clip there,
no problem.
so he could use this against you. By the way,
I have no problem with him
let's
doing
keep
that.
our fingers crossed.
I've got no problem with him doing that. I would actually invite him to do that. I'll tell you why.
Oh,
When you
we'll see.
compare the methodology of the scholars and the sources that they use, you need to have some grasp of where they're coming from and where they're leading you to. The fact that he does not cite them in this case within that very context for the point that he wants us to lead to indicates to me that they likely did not confirm the ideas that he had already presupposed. You will note here that at least in this work, it mentions the latter view is the view that it was most commonly held, with AD 80 being suggested as a round figure. So
Yeah.
most scholarship that I've looked at said
Mm.
between the year 80 and the year 90, almost it. So
Right.
the temple was destroyed in the year 70. So it's between a decade to 2 decades later that people believe Luke and Acts were likely written.
Okay.
Let's continue. Bismillah.
Please.
Now, Leon Morris gives us some data to consider for both the late and the early dates in its commentary. With respect to the late date, some sayings of Jesus seem to show that Luke was writing after the fall of Jerusalem. Luke used Mark, and therefore must be later than AD 68. Now, of course, this assumes Mark in priority, as well as dates for Mark somewhere in probably about the mid-60s. So those are two assumptions. There is no good reason for dating Luke far from Matthew, and Luke tells us that many had written before him in his introduction. Leon Morris also lists some data that points to an early date. Acts ends with Paul in prison. The pastoral letters seem to show that Paul visited Ephesus again. Luke notes the fulfillment of the prophecy of Agabus. Acts shows no knowledge of the Pauline epistles, and so must be early. And finally, no event after AD 62 is mentioned. So let's wrap up.
I want to point out something here. Let me know if you noticed this, Brother Farid. When he was listing the reasons for the later composition, he said, "This is an assumption."
Yes. والله bro, والله I was gonna be like يا أخي كل شيء أنت عندك assumption يا أخي أنت حين. I was gonna like burst out like that, man. Like help myself. I help myself back.
Oh man, it hit me. I'm like, what is he saying here? Let's continue. Let's see how he wraps this up. No assumptions for the early dating, but only assumptions for the later one. I love this guy's methodology. It's beautiful in a bad way. Let's continue.
Man, you gotta give it to him, man. He's got the toughest job in the world. The guy's got the toughest job in the world, man. He gotta be like this. Yeah. If I imagine you were defending the authorship of
I don't think I would. I got to be honest. If I was born into Christianity and this was the level of reasons that should lead me to faith in Christ, I would have apostated at the age of 5.
Oh wow, man! I think I'd be one of those priests that say, "Stop asking hard questions" or stuff like that.
You will again notice here he doesn't tell the audience like he did for the gospel on Matthew video. You can have options. You can choose the later or the earlier. He clearly has a preference at this point, as if the later dating hurts his case. So clearly here his bias is coming out, his apologetics is coming out, his polemics are showing. And that's peculiar because he tries to come across as well-read and scholarly, but being well-read and scholarly does not mean that your methodology is free from the biases you already hold, and clearly it's demonstrated in this video.
Both from the material relevant to Luke in the introduction to this series, as well as what we've covered in this video. It is improbable that the Gospel could have been renamed from another author and distributed so quickly. The book is universally ascribed to Luke in ancient tradition. We have no indication that the Gospel ever circulated without an appropriate title. It is implausible to assign authorship illegitimately to a non-apostle. Internal evidence coheres with Lucan authorship. Luke and Acts share the same author. There are numerous connections between Luke and Paul, attested to both in the New Testament and extra-biblical sources. And Luke was plausibly written in the early 60s.
Bro, he brought it back to the early 60s, man.
Oh, man.
He brought it back to the early 60s, mashallah.
He jumped at that opportunity to give it such an early date. Let me tell you,
Wow.
the Super Mario Brothers, the game when you jump to get the flag. My boy was using rockets to get the early 60s date at this point. So I think that suffices. Alhamdulillah, that's generally the video there.
There's one thing that's really important. If you could go back to the part where he mentions like 4 things about Luke, what makes Luke a good author. These are the reasons to believe that Luke was a reliable author. Or well, not really. He doesn't really present it as that. But here's what we have. He mentions some matters that are supposed to be useful for knowing more about Luke. Possibly a Gentile, irrelevant, educated, maybe
Possibly relevant.
Educated? Say what?
I think it's possibly relevant because it tells us that he copied from,
Yes.
he used other sources as a template, popular works
Okay.
at that time.
Okay. Proficient in Greek. All right, I don't mind. Now the main thing to me is versatile and competent writer. Is he?
Well, here was the question. If one of the reasons here for the author of the gospel attributed to Luke is that he's a versatile and competent writer, could that not be said about any of the authors? Why does he only mention it for this particular gospel? And how does that differentiate it from any of the other gospel writers? Were they not competent in the first place?
I was more curious about the statement competent writer in the sense of is there any reason to assume that he was a competent writer?
I would say that he seems to be well read, and the form of Greek that he uses seems to be as if he had some training in the language. And
Okay.
it's possible, like, how you can tell the difference between a person that graduated university and a person that left at like 5th grade. You can tell, okay, that's the sense at which you can compare one with the other.
All right, great. So we have what we would refer to as perhaps to some extent we could refer to this as his dhabt. What about his adala? Is there any reason to assume that this person is reliable as an author?
Well, he does quote sources and only changes them in regards to like sexual promiscuity.
Is there anyone who refers to him as reliable?
No, they don't mention him by name early on, right? So it's only the later people that say that because he wrote the gospel and it's the word of God, therefore we must trust it. They don't speak to that person's character on any level.
Okay. Is there anything? Of course, I'm looking at this purely as a student of hadith. Is there anything in I don't know, man, in the NT that describes Luke as someone who is a good person?
Well, because he's close with Paul, one has to assume that he had some level of good character in the early church. And if he was that companion of Paul, I think that's how they would look at him, generally speaking.
Okay. Okay, so it's just his companionship to Paul.
Yes.
What about Judas's companionship to Jesus? Doesn't that make Judas a good person?
Initially, yes. Later on, no.
Okay, so I think that would be my issue. I think that would be my issue. He does seem to be unknown when it comes to his, not just unknown in character. Even if we assume that this is Luke the physician, even if we hold that opinion, I don't really have any reason to assume that he was reliable, as in that he was a good, upstanding person with upstanding character that would not lie and would not fabricate material to suit his
Well,
beliefs, ideology.
that is peculiar because his resurrection story differs a lot with Matthew, and of course, Mark does not mention one. There's almost no equivalent to his resurrection stories and that of the gospel attributed to Matthew. So scholars have supposed that either he had a special source, which is
Mm,
now unknown to us, for the
mm,
resurrection stories and sayings, or he made it up himself. Um,
okay.
to me, the way I would look at it, if I know that he used other sources previously, I would assume he may have taken some oral tradition, probably, and that's why he says he's writing a complete narrative about Jesus. Because again, Mark does not have that narrative of the resurrection, and
Right.
so he seems to complete what Mark did not complete himself.
Right.
And because it has no equivalent, almost no equivalent in Matthew, and there are significant differences, it
Okay.
does lead me to believe it is possible, if not plausible, that some details were fudged by him in order
Okay.
to affirm his belief, I think. Remember, he's
Very,
writing this to a
very interesting.
friend to confirm what that friend was taught, right? That's what he
Okay.
writes at the beginning. Keep that in
That's
mind.
interesting. That's interesting.
Remember,
Uh,
propaganda, just to be clear, propaganda, but
yeah.
the purpose of propaganda is to convince somebody of something. So in this case, if Theophilus already believed and he merely wanted to confirm what Theophilus, his friend, believed already, then it makes sense. He writes a work, sticks to resurrection at the end, and Theophilus is like, okay, I got a source I can refer to. I'm good to go.
Okay. Um, I, I also wanted to ask about does Paul praise Luke
He
anywhere?
calls him he calls him a companion. I believe he does refer to him as a physician, and I think he calls him a dear friend. I could be mistaken on the last one.
Okay. Um,
But that is to point out here that half of the letters attributed to Paul we know were not written by Paul. So
really?
yeah, so so now we
I
see
thought this was a conclusive matter.
no. So at least so Paul wrote between 13 to 14 books of the New Testament.
Yeah.
Of those 14, about 6 to 7 of them scholars believe he most likely wrote. The others are written in his name. I have not double checked which books that Colin himself
Right.
appeals to confirm the statements about Luke. But I
Right.
could imagine if Paul was famous and he was known to have a famous friend called Luke, anyone could mention Luke in that capacity, and it would just generally be accepted without question.
Okay. I think from our discussion today, it seems like it. Yeah, I'm trying to be as fair as possible. It does seem like Luke has more going for him than Matthew and Mark in
Mhm.
regards to who it's attributed to. It really feels like this Luke, whoever he was the author. I'm leaning to yeah. I'm open to him being a Luke who's a physician who wrote it. Who knows, man? 60 to 80 to 90, whatever, whatever you want, Colin. Let's give it a 60 if you want. But I have an issue with his sources because even then he doesn't mention who his sources are, and he just says, "Hey, some eyewitnesses, maybe," and that for me doesn't work.
It works
But
for
yeah,
Colin though. So
it does work for Colin. And but this itself suggests that it is a more reliable source than Matthew and Mark.
well,
Because
you need to keep in mind that he is using Mark as a
yes,
source.
yes, you're
And
right. I take that back. Then I take that back. But at least we kind of have an idea of who may have written this, as opposed
yes,
to the rest. And even at that point, we're not sure if it's actually Luke who wrote it. But yeah, at least we're closer to having an identity for the author. That's all. That's all I have at the moment. Barakallah feek, man. Anything you want to wrap this up
no,
with?
I think you summed it up beautifully. May Allah reward you. I know that this can be daunting for a Muslim, I think, getting into these like nitty-gritty details. But at least at this point, when Muslims view this video and Christians look at it as well, you're going to understand that we're not making up sources as we go along. We actually look at primary sources. We look at your
Right.
scholarly literature. We actually try to be fair in regards to what you're saying, as opposed to reading Muslim books that speak on these issues. In
Right.
fact, in none of the sessions that
I
we've
will
had,
admit to reading badly written Muslim books. So
I didn't. So
okay. So stick with Ijaz's stuff. Ignore my stuff.
subhanallah. All right. Thank you, brother, for the opportunity.
Habibi, much appreciated, man. Thanks for your time. We're gonna be back soon with John, inshallah. Habibi,
Inshallah.
take care of yourself, man.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.